Hi, thank you so much for having me to talk to you. This is a little bit different because we have such a dramatic time difference that I'm pre-recording this for you all. But I'm hopeful that this will be an inspiring talk for you and we can do some question and answer after this as well. So it'll feel like we're together, even though we're technically not. So again, thank you for having me. My name is Sydney Chaffee. I've been teaching for 15 years. Currently, I teach at a school called Codman Academy Charter Public School in Boston, Massachusetts, here in the USA. My class is called Humanities, and the title of my course is called Justice and Injustice. And it's an interdisciplinary course weaving together English and history content and skills, and also a little bit of theater. And I have written here that it's also an inclusion course because I have all kinds of different students, including students with special education needs in my classroom together. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. My learners are mostly 14 and 15 years old, which is the 9th grade here in America. And they are curious, they're compassionate, they're clever, and as I just mentioned, they're also really diverse as learners. So some of them have learning disabilities. Some of them are learning English as a second or a third language. Some of them love to read. Some of them hate to read. And on a recent reading and writing assessment that we gave a few weeks ago, the range of their scores was very, very wide. So as a teacher in an inclusion setting, one important part of my job is to ensure that every student in my class can be successful in meeting our learning standards. So I'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later when I take you through what a lesson in my class might look like. So, my slides are not working. There we go. So this is just a few snapshots of me with some of my students from the last few years, just to give you a sense of what it might look like in my classroom when I'm helping students when we aren't in the middle of a pandemic, because right now I'm doing all of my teaching fully remotely over the computer, just like this. So I've gotten very used to, very comfortable with Zoom in this past several months, and that's how I'm teaching right now. So I'll tell you a little bit about my journey to becoming a teacher. Before I came to the school that I'm at now, I taught for 2 years in an after-school program while I was earning my master's degree in education from Lesley University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And then before that, I was working on earning my bachelor's degree from Sarah Lawrence College in New York. And so teaching is the only job I've ever known. And I feel very lucky to have discovered that this is my life's work so early on. I have friends who didn't realize that they wanted to be teachers until they had worked for years in another field. But I had an epiphany one day at Sarah Lawrence as an undergraduate student, and I knew that this is what I should do. And so before that epiphany, I thought that I wanted to be a poet, and I went off to college to study poetry. After a year of doing that, my professor, who was a Pulitzer Prize-winning poet, told me that he thought I wasn't really meant to be a poet, and he was probably right. So I spent a couple of years trying to write fiction and taking a lot of classes in women's history, and that's how I met my mentor, Professor Lida Cullen-Sizer. And in her classes, I learned about more than just history. Her classes taught me what great teaching looks like. Lida asked a lot of questions. She expected us to take turns facilitating the class discussions, and she made us write a lot. So Lida saw us students as intellectuals, and she believed that we would rise to meet her expectations. And I learned that she actually comes from a family of teachers. Lida's parents are named Nancy and Ted Sizer, and they are two very famous American educators. So when I told Lida, as an undergraduate at Sarah Lawrence, that I wanted to become a teacher just like her, she reached behind her. We were sitting in her office, which is full of bookshelves. So she reached behind her onto one of those bookshelves and she pulled a blue book off the shelf. And it was a book that her father had written titled Horace's Compromise. And so she sent me away to read it. And that's how my journey as a teacher started. I've been teaching and trying to become a better teacher ever since then. And then in 2017, I was named the US National Teacher of the Year. So here is a picture of me in the Oval Office of the US White House. And you can see the arrow is pointing to me there next to the president at that time, Donald Trump. And surrounding me are all of my Teacher of the Year colleagues and friends from states all across the country. So I'll talk to you a little bit about how I became the Teacher of the Year, what that process looks like, and then what that role means. So the process for being named a Teacher of the Year here in America varies from state to state. And in my state, Massachusetts, anyone can nominate a teacher as long as that teacher is licensed and has been teaching for at least 3 years. So I'll show you how I went through this process. So in my case, it started with my principal nominating me. And once I was nominated, I had to write several essays, I believe it was 5, and submit my resume to the State Department of Education. And from there, based on the essays and the letter of recommendation, the Department of Ed selected me as one of several semifinalists. So I had to write another essay, and then representatives from the Department of Ed came to my class to watch me teach. They talked to a few of my colleagues. They did a follow-up phone interview with me to talk about the lesson that they had seen. And then they named me a finalist. And as a finalist, I had to do a presentation for a panel of educators and education leaders in the state of Massachusetts, including some former teachers of the year, school principals, school superintendents. They interviewed me. They interviewed the other 2 finalists. They asked us each to give a short presentation to sort of tell them more about who we were. And then they had us do an activity together so they could learn a little bit more about our communication style, our collaboration skills. And although all 3 of us were strong teachers who impressed the panel, I'm still in contact with the other 2 finalists from that year. They're great teachers. Ultimately, the panel decided to select me to become the 2017 Massachusetts Teacher of the Year. Now, in other states, the process is a little bit different. Some states select one Teacher of the Year from each county, and then they put all of those teachers up against one another for the State Teacher of the Year title. In California, there are 4 or 5 State Teachers of the Year, and then one is selected to go on to represent California in the national competition. Some states have their Teachers of the Year serve for 2 years. In some states, the Teacher of the Year continues to teach. That's what happened with me in Massachusetts. But in other years, the Teacher of the Year in other states, the Teacher of the Year takes a sabbatical. And they spend the year traveling around and speaking and giving workshops, or they actually work at the State Department of Ed for the year. And so the process looks quite different depending on where in the country you are from. Okay, so once each state has chosen its State Teacher of the Year, that group of teachers become the candidates for the National Teacher of the Year. So the process there is that I was named the Massachusetts Teacher of the Year. I then submitted my resume and 5 essays to the National Teacher of the Year Selection Committee, which was composed of about 20 different people who are leaders in education from across the country, representing the teachers' unions, representing parent and family organizations, higher education, early education, all sorts of different stakeholders in education. The panel then selected 4 finalists. I was one of them based on those essays. And we went to Washington, D.C. to give another presentation, to do a media interview, and to do an interview with that panel. And based on that, I was selected as the 2017 National Teacher of the Year. Now, that panel is looking for several criteria when they interview the finalists. They're looking for a respected teacher who helps all students achieve success, someone who deliberately connects the classroom with the community, someone who collaborates with students, families, and colleagues, and someone who can speak clearly and passionately about education to a wide variety of audiences. So that process was the scariest and most intimidating interview process I have ever been a part of. But at that point, I was able to serve as the 2017 National Teacher of the Year. And so as National Teacher of the Year, again, so that's what brought me to this room. So as National Teacher of the Year, I didn't teach that year. I maintained a full schedule of speaking and traveling all over the country and to some other countries as well to talk to folks about what it is to be a teacher in America, what are educators thinking about, what do we value, what do we want to advocate for in education. And one thing that I always made sure to tell people when I went to speak as Teacher of the Year is that being selected as the National Teacher of the Year does not mean that I was being called the best teacher in America, because it would be impossible for us to determine who the best teacher in America is. It would be impossible for us to decide that there's just one best teacher. And even if we could do that, I don't think that that person is me. There's a lot that I have to learn. Being the teacher of the year means instead that you are selected to be a representative for teachers, that you can speak and be an ambassador for the experiences of educators. You can represent what good teachers are doing across the country. And you can talk about, your experiences, your beliefs, your hopes, all of that. So once my year as National Teacher of the Year came to an end, I returned to my classroom. I'm still teaching now. My role has changed slightly. So I still say that my primary job is teaching. That's my number one responsibility. That's the thing that I love the most. But I now am also an instructional coach for other humanities teachers at my school. So I'm helping them reflect on their practice and set goals and get better. I still do some speaking engagements like this one in between teaching. Sometimes I'm invited to write about teaching, which is really great. And in order to make time for all of those different jobs to be possible, I now have a teaching fellow who works alongside me in my classroom. I help train them as a new teacher, and they help teach the class to give me enough time to do those other jobs. So although my role as a teacher hasn't changed, I'm really fortunate to have many new opportunities available to me as a result of being named National Teacher of the Year. So people always want to know what sets me apart. They always ask, what makes you special? Why were you selected? So first, I want to remind you of what I said a few moments ago, which is that I am a representative, right? That year I was chosen to be a representative, to be an ambassador, not to be held up as the ultimate best teacher. So this question is really hard to answer. There are some things that I do that I think are representative of great teachers all over the country. And I also think that the fact that I am still learning, the fact that I do still make mistakes, also makes me a representative of great teaching. I think it's important for us to acknowledge that even teachers who are held up as great teachers are still learning and still sometimes mess this up, right? That teaching and being a great teacher, it's part of it is just this constant process of growing and learning and getting better. So I do think that some of the things that I do are representative of what great teachers across the country and across the world do. So I'll share some of that with you now to try to answer this question of why I was selected. So at my school, at the beginning of every school year, we ask our new 9th graders this question. We say, what is your passion in life, right? And the answers that we get are really fascinating windows into our students' minds. Some kids are passionate about playing video games or playing basketball or piano or fixing things or helping people. Our students have big dreams. They are driven. And so a few years back, I asked myself, what's my passion in life? What drives me? What gets me out of bed in the morning, right? What keeps me up at night? What's that thing that subtracted from my life would leave me feeling lost and purposeless? And the obvious first answer to those questions is teaching. Teaching is my passion. But I dug a little further into that and I said, well, what is it about teaching? What's the part of that, if I had to distill it down, that's really my passion? And I decided that the answer is storytelling. Teaching is storytelling. Teaching is most electric when I'm helping students explore the stories of the people who made history happen, or when I'm helping them hone their skills in telling their own stories. Teaching is like existing in a ball of sparks and light when kids' brains and hearts are wide open to new stories. And so if we think about storytelling, there's a storytelling framework that I really love. It comes from the idea that stories from all over the world, stories from different times, stories from different cultures, they follow this similar arc. And the arc is called the hero's journey. So I'm going to show you that now. See, I just talked about how great I am at using Zoom, and now I'm fumbling with this. So I'll share my screen with you again, talk to you about the hero's journey. So in the hero's journey, we start with our protagonist, represented here. And the protagonist is living in a normal world, and then they're called to an adventure. And in order to go on that adventure, they have to cross the threshold from their known world into an unknown world and face a series of challenges. And having overcome those obstacles, they return to their normal life, transformed in some way by the experience. So this is a framework, this is an arc that you see in stories all over the place, all throughout time, all over the globe. You'll see this similar arc. It's in movies that are being made today. It's in the books that our kids love. Sometimes the people who are creating these pieces of art don't even realize that they're sort of following this archetype of the hero's journey. So the hero's journey is a way of understanding storytelling. But obviously in our own real lives, things don't always fall into place this neatly. But at the same time, humans are master storytellers. We make sense of our world and our lives by telling stories. And so inevitably, even though real life doesn't conform to the hero's journey, in our memory, in our retellings, we sometimes shape the events of our lives into this circular pattern. We hyperbolize and turn people into monsters. We reflect on what we've learned. We tie things up neatly. And school is so important in this mythologizing. It becomes the setting of some of our most pivotal moments as young people. In some ways, we grow up at school. We learn who we are there. School becomes imprinted in our memories, which means, whether we like it or not, as educators, we will show up in our students' myths about how they became who they are. And so the question is, how do we want to feature in our students' stories of their lives? For students, each new school year represents another journey. When they step through our classroom doors, or maybe seeing how things are going when they log into our Zoom room for the first time, they're crossing the threshold between a known and an unknown realm. And so we have to remember to see our kids in context. Our students bring everything on these journeys with them. Whatever they're facing outside of school comes through the door with them, sits at their desk with them. The weight they carry becomes part of the landscape of school for them. And so think for a second of what kinds of weight you were carrying into school as a child. What was unavoidable and unshakable for you? What crept in no matter how hard you tried to push it out and made it impossible for you to focus on parabolas or prepositions? When our kids come into our classrooms, some of them will be grappling with their parents' divorce, or a family member's death or incarceration or absence. Some of them will be learning a new language. Some of them will be hungry. Some will have learning differences and will battle the shame that too often comes with those differences. Because of trauma, some will be at war with their own brains, which tell them that they are in mortal danger at the slightest perceived threat. And some of our kids, especially here in America, will walk in knowing that they are up against hundreds of years of racist stereotypes that say that they're not smart, or that they are dangerous or expendable, or that they are everything but the awe-inspiring creatures that their families know them to be. And all of our students will encounter challenges by design in our classes too. All of these myriad challenges will manifest in our schools. But despite the weight our students carry, they all deserve to feel like heroes. As educators, that's our responsibility and our privilege. We have the opportunity to help our students through some of the most difficult things they've ever encountered. We have the great honor of reminding them every day that they matter and that they can triumph. But let me be clear. When I say I want all of our students to feel like heroes, I don't mean superheroes. I don't mean Superman. I don't mean Wonder Woman. I mean the kinds of heroes that you see in the hero's journey. That is ordinary, flawed people who travel into an unknown world, who face challenges, who fall down, who make mistakes, and eventually, with help, overcome. This kind of hero. These are my students from a few years ago. This is my students at the end of putting on a play that many of them thought they would not be able to put on, performing in front of an audience of people on a real stage. And this is their moment of triumph where they've overcome those challenges where they've come out on the other side more confident in themselves. All of our students deserve to come out of our schools, deserve to leave learning experiences with us feeling like this kind of hero. So how do we do that? How do we make sure that when our students look back and arrange the careful mythology of their lives, they see themselves as triumphant? How do we make sure that when they think about the challenges they faced within our classrooms, those challenges feel affirming and transformative for them and not oppressive and scarring? Like most things in teaching, unfortunately, we sometimes aren't going to figure this out until we mess it up. So I'm going to tell you about a story about one time that I messed up, one of many, and how that moment has continued to push me to grow, even 15 plus years later. So here's me in 2005 as a brand new teacher. You can tell I'm a brand new teacher because I'm fresh-faced and idealistic, and I am stapling a lot of color-coded papers together by hand. This is me just starting out on my journey. Now, one day this year, I was working in that after-school program that I talked about briefly before. And I had planned this great lesson for my students who were 8th graders, so they were 13 and 14 years old. And this one student named Chris came in and he refused to participate in my lesson. And as a new teacher, this was very threatening for me because no one had ever taught me what to do if a student just refused to do what I said. And so I did the only thing I could think of, which was that I pulled him into the hallway and I said, "You have to participate." And he said, "No, this is stupid." And so now the alarm bells in my head were all going off. And I was sure that if I didn't handle the situation, the entire class would revolt and I would be fired and my career would be over just as it was starting. And so I said to Chris, "You are being disrespectful." Because no one had ever told me that if you want 13, 14, or 15-year-old child to shut down completely, all you need to do is tell them that they're being disrespectful. So as you can imagine, that didn't go over so well. Chris stared at the floor. He refused to respond to anything else that I said. And so I went to my boss, and my boss called Chris's mom, and Chris got in trouble, and that was that. So fast forward. 5 years later, I was teaching at the same school that I teach now. And Chris was a student there, but he was now a senior. He was 18 years old. He was about to graduate and go off to college. And one day he saw me in the hallway and he brought up that day, 5 years earlier, when he was 13 or 14. He said to me, "You were so mean to me. I hated you." And I was shocked. I couldn't believe he was remembering it that way. And my initial reaction was, how could he say that about me? How could he say I was mean? He was the one who was being mean. He was the one who was being unreasonable. And it stuck with me. I couldn't stop thinking about it. And it took me a long time to realize that I had missed the point. That, of course, Chris's understanding and Chris's memory of what had happened that day was valid. I thought that day that I was being firm, and he thought that I was being inflexible. I thought that I was holding high expectations, and he believed that I was treating him unfairly. I thought it was no big deal, and he remembered it vividly years later. And I slowly came to see that what Chris had needed in that moment was for me to really listen to him. And it took me even longer to get that there were layers and layers to my interaction with Chris, who was a young Black man in a classroom helmed by me, an inexperienced white female teacher, likely one in a long line of inexperienced white female teachers he had encountered in his educational career, who didn't take the time to build relationships with him, who expected the worst of him, who harmed him with our assumptions and our bias and our racism. And before you get the wrong idea, I'm not saying that I should have just ignored the fact that Chris was disengaged in class that day so long ago. I'm not saying that I should have lowered my expectations for him or said, it's okay, you don't have to do the lesson. That's not a solution. That's not right. But what I'm saying is that there were more compassionate ways for me to respond to him in that moment, to remember to see him as a child rather than as a problem or a threat. So let's put this story up against the framework of the hero's journey. In my mythology, that incident with Chris had not even made it to the final draft. But in Chris's version of the hero's journey, where he's the hero going on the journey, that moment with me represented one of the trials or challenges that he had to endure. And the worst part, when I think about it now, was that I was the monster. I was the thing that was holding him back. And if that's not the last thing we want to be as teachers, I don't know what is. Despite my idealistic visions of the kind of teacher I thought I was, despite wanting badly to be the kind of teacher like Professor Lida who had inspired me, I missed an opportunity to live my stated values. Students like Chris sit in our classrooms every day. Chris wasn't an extraordinarily troubled child. He was a normal student having a normal bad day that I turned into a very big deal because I didn't know how to handle it with compassion. I didn't know enough, for example, to pause and ask him how his day was going before launching into a lecture and delivering an ultimatum. As teachers, we may not be able to prevent or extinguish a child's pain. We may not always understand the Chris's that walk into our classrooms. We may not always get it right the first time, but it's our job to keep working at it. In the hero's journey, you'll see there's this notion of the mentor or the helper who guides and supports the hero as they encounter this period of trials and challenges. And ideally, that's where we come in, to be our students' helpers and mentors as they work through challenges and come out on the other side stronger and smarter for it. Not to save them, but to champion them. Because every student deserves to feel like a hero in their own story. Now, working in schools, working with young people, it's very rarely going to feel easy or simple, especially once the school year is in full swing. We have a million things on our plates and the copy machine is broken again, or we all of a sudden have to teach all of our classes virtually or with masks on because of a pandemic. And in those moments, it can become easy for us to rationalize away how important it is to build relationships with students to help them triumph. We might tell ourselves there isn't enough time, or it's too hard, and we just need to focus on getting to the end of the unit. We might tell ourselves that the work of reflecting on the times we got it wrong or our own implicit bias can happen later. And what makes it even harder is that as educators, we may not see the results of our work right away, or at all. We may never know the impact we've had on some of the students we work with. But the work can't wait. Our students deserve more from us than that. If we're truly committed to them, then we have to take on these challenges with courage. If we all did that, imagine what that might look like for our students. Imagine the obstacles they would overcome. Imagine what they'd learn about the world and about themselves. And imagine too how much better we would be as teachers for every child. Okay, so I know that all of this is easy for me to say. But the question, of course, is how do we actually do it? How do we ensure that our kids feel safe and welcome and seen in our classrooms? How do we ensure that our classrooms are nurturing places where all of our students can learn and grow? How do we collaborate with young people to create classrooms that are incubators for their great ideas, where they can plan all of the ways that they will change the world? I'm not going to pretend to have all the answers, but I will tell you a little bit about what a day in the life of my classroom might look like. So here are some of the ways that I try to ensure that my classroom is a place where all kids can learn and can feel like heroes. And so as I go through this, I'm going to try to highlight a few important aspects of my teaching philosophy. So let me get these for you. Here are 4 things that I think are really important when we're working with young people. First, I believe that relationships with young people are key, as I just talked about with the story of Chris. Second, I believe that all students deserve equitable access to the curriculum. You heard me talk earlier about being a teacher in an inclusion setting and needing to make sure that I can work with students who have a wide range of abilities, skills, and mindsets about learning. Third, I believe that learning should be relevant to students' lives and should be authentic. And finally, I believe that social justice belongs in our schools. So as I show you this next agenda, which is an agenda for a lesson I taught a few weeks ago, I'm going to try to come back to these 4 ideas and explain how this shows these ideas. Now, this lesson is not the best lesson I've ever taught. It certainly doesn't show every part of who I am as a teacher, but I think that this is an authentic sort of peek into a normal day in the life of our class. So here I'm sharing with you now the slides that I shared with the students. So I'm not going to talk about every piece of this, but I'll just highlight a few things. So the first thing that happens when students joined our Zoom meeting that day is that they saw this little getting to know you question down here. And this question had been written by one of their classmates. Starting with a little question like this is a light and low pressure way to greet students in the morning, to invite them into a conversation. It's one way that my co-teacher and I are trying to get to know our students better, to form a community in the classroom, even though we've never met one another in person. We've been teaching online all this year. And usually if we were in the building together, I would start my class with an academic activity to get the students into the task of the day right away. But since we're all online, I wanted to make sure I built in these moments. They won't happen organically otherwise. You know, there's no space for students to sort of stop into the classroom and say hi the way they could if we were in person. So this tiny moment is one way to engage students and to build relationships with them. If I want to be able to push students academically outside of their comfort zones, I have to have that foundation of a relationship with them so they trust me enough to let me push them. Okay, so once we started out, then we jumped into the actual lesson. So we always start by setting some context for students of what we're going to be doing that day. So we start out by giving them the agenda. Here's what we're going to do today. And by asking them how they're going to show that day's habit of scholarship. So at my school, we have 5 habits of scholarship that we believe students should build in order to be not only strong students, but also strong citizens and strong people. So those 5 habits are effort, which you'll see in this lesson, collaboration, critique, compassion, and responsibility. So each day I'm going to give my students one of those habits of scholarship and say, this is the one I want you to focus on today. You'll see down here, this presentation is a Pear Deck. I really like Pear Deck as a way to deliver lessons online in a way that's a little bit more engaging and then invites students to be in conversation with us. So for this slide, Pear Deck is just, it's an interactive slideshow. So on this slide where I asked them, how will you show effort today? On their screen, they had a box that they could type into. And then on my end, I could read all of their goals for effort. And so I was reading some of them out loud and saying, oh, I see that someone says they're going to try to, answer a question in class today. I see that this person says they're going to try to stay really focused today. And so just again, inviting students to think about their own learning and to think about what it is that they want to get out of class. So I believe that in the classroom, students and teachers need to work together to construct the culture of the classroom. And again, this comes back to this idea of relationship. And I'm inviting them to help me construct the class that we want. After we went over that, then we talk about the guiding questions for the week. So our guiding questions are, here are the big questions that are going to try to show why this learning that we're doing is relevant. Why does this learning matter? What are we trying to figure out? What are we trying to aim at? So you can see that in this lesson, this is part of a unit where we're looking at when, how, and why white Europeans invented and used concepts of race and racism to justify oppressing Black, Indigenous, and people of color throughout history. So this ties to the idea that learning should be relevant and authentic, and that social justice belongs in the classroom. The vast majority of my students are Black and Latinx students of color. And so learning about the history of race and racism, learning about the genesis of some of these ideas that they see playing out in their lives every day is very relevant to them. I've had a lot of students over the years ask me, where did racism come from? Why did white people do this in history? Why did white people do that? And so we're exploring those questions. So that's also authentic because the questions that we're exploring are coming straight from students. They're interested in figuring out the answers to this. So we look at the guiding questions, and then the last thing we look at is our learning targets. So we're always going to be looking at what are our goals? What are we aimed at learning for the day? So you can see on this day, there's this big picture goal of, okay, so how did white people justify racism, as I just talked about? And then we also have a more specifically skill-based learning target about using vocab. So how are we going to use vocabulary? How are we going to build our vocabulary skills? And then I've also got two other categories here. So relevance. So this comes back to my belief that learning should be relevant. I want students to understand why we're learning what we're learning. I'm sure you can remember, or you can think of a student who has asked, why are we learning this? Why does this matter? I remember for me as a student, I always thought that about math. I always wondered, why do I need to know this? And so really explaining to students, here's why we're doing this in this relevance column, again, helps me feel like we're pulling the students in and we're helping together to create an experience of learning that matters. And then finally, the success criteria. So to tell students, here's how you'll know if you've been successful today. I want to give students the power to assess their own learning. I want students to be able to internalize what they're doing and to be able to articulate whether they've hit the goals. And again, it's coming down to learning being authentic, learning being relevant, and sort of this idea of students being in the driver's seat. Finally, another note about the learning targets. These learning targets are aligned with the state standards for English language instruction. So in my class, I'm always trying to use the really relevant and engaging history content to drive the English skills instruction. Okay, so once we've sort of set the context for students, which just takes a few minutes, and this is all a matter of routines. We have student leaders who are reading the different parts of these slides aloud. Then we're ready to jump into the content of the lesson. So on this day, our first task was to do some vocabulary review. Now, these were our 5 new words, which students had been struggling with. And so this task shows a few aspects of my teaching philosophy and action. It shows equitable access because we're reviewing vocabulary words to make sure that all students are understanding. It shows learning being relevant because, again, these vocabulary words are tied to these big picture concepts about race and racism and history. And it also ties to the idea of social justice in the curriculum, because we are talking about, for example, anti-racism, which is not purely a historical context. Anti-racism is a current day movement and idea that our students can connect to and can decide, I want to be anti-racist. And so we reviewed the vocab in a few different ways. We went back to the learning target and sort of showed the words in context. We reviewed our definitions. We asked students, again, using an interactive slideshow to create sentences, and then we talked about some of the sentences they came up with. Again, this is a way to make sure that learning is equitable and that all students have access, because I was able to give them the definition, give them a chance to write a sentence, and then give them individual feedback in the moment using this online platform to say, hey, that's a great sentence, or try adding this to your sentence to make it a little bit more specific. So we're just sort of using these words and playing with them. And then we used a text. So this book is called Stamped. It just came out this year and it's incredibly engaging for students. It is the history of racist and anti-racist ideas. the students really like it. We had just started it. So we were looking at this passage, which we had read the other day, to again see our vocabulary words in context. So this again shows this notion of learning being relevant. I think I used to teach vocabulary as just a list of words out of context. And I think teaching vocabulary that way, kids might learn a bunch of words, but the relevance is missing. They don't really know why they're learning those words, and they might not see how those words fit into larger concepts that you're studying. So I always like to make sure that my vocabulary connects to these big picture ideas in some way. I think that students will be more empowered to use the words if they have sort of a reason, something that these words fit into. So we were learning these 3 words: segregationist, assimilationist, and anti-racist. We were using this sort of challenging text to figure out what the words meant. This was also a piece of equitable access because we were rereading this. We had already read this passage. Kids had had trouble with it, so we're going back to it. Then again, we're going over the definitions. And then here we were reviewing some of the ideas that students had come up with. So again, coming back to the idea that students and teachers are sort of co-creating knowledge in the classroom, that we're building relationships with each other, and that the learning is relevant and authentic because the learning is coming from the students. The day before, students had worked in small groups to come up with examples of these 3 words because they had really been having trouble with them. And so by attributing the different examples to the different groups, I was sort of showing students what they had done well, and giving students a chance to shine, giving students a chance to be experts. When students saw that their group's work was up on the slide, they felt quite a bit of pride. And then also recognizing that the way I had tried to teach these words hadn't quite worked. So letting the students take control, showing what the students had come up with, worked much better. For example, this video over here, I have never seen it, I have never heard of it. But as soon as I showed this on the screen, a bunch of students said, "Oh, that makes sense to me." So again, going back to the relevance, making sure that the learning that we're doing, that we can tap into our students' prior knowledge and we can connect what we're doing to what they know, what they're interested in, what they recognize, to then expand their knowledge. So once we did all of this vocab, we went into the next part of our lesson, which again was based on this book Stamped. So our work with this text, again, exemplifies my belief that learning should be relevant, as well as the fact that engaging and meaningful history content should drive our English skill building work. So we were doing vocabulary building in this part of the lesson. We were reading a challenging text together. We were working on the skill of using evidence from the text to support our ideas. And we were also laying a foundation in this part of the lesson where in the next lesson, we could practice more English skills, such as identifying the author's main idea. So this part of the lesson, if you could have seen it, it was a very proud moment for me because we were reading this book out loud together and the students were incredibly engaged. We would read a little bit and then stop, talk to the students, say, okay, so what's happening in this part of the book? Tell us, share out, what's the gist? What's going on? The students would share out. They would say, well, this is what he's saying. Then another student might come in and say, well, I have a question about that. And again, the knowledge was being co-created. We were building on our relationships with students to talk about the book. They were making connections between the book and what they already knew. And they were making connections between the book and their own lives, which again connects to the idea of social justice. That if our students are learning about race and racism, if they're learning about the history of some of these harmful ideas, they're also starting to learn about what can be done to combat those ideas. Some of that social justice work is going to happen a little later in this unit, but everything that we're doing is building to it. So the learning is more meaningful because it's situated in this larger context of something that matters, of a problem in the world right now, racism, and then what we can do about it. What has happened in history and what can we do now? So at the end of the lesson, I'm going to fast forward through this. At the end of the lesson, we come back to these learning targets and we give students a chance to self-assess. I want students to understand where they are with their learning. I want them to have a chance to be metacognitive. And I also see this as an issue of equitable access. Okay, so I want students to have a moment to think about where they're at and to communicate to me and my co-teacher how they think they're doing on this, so that we can then look at this data afterward and we can say, this student doesn't seem to think that they understand. Let's look at their work. Let's talk with them. Let's see what we need to do to support them. So what I hope is coming across and what I've shown you from this little lesson is that there's a lot of communication between the students and me and my co-teacher. There's a lot of information in a lot of different formats. They're typing in the chat, they're answering on these slides, they're coming off of mute and speaking aloud. There are a lot of different ways that students are present and vocal in this lesson, and that's important to me. So that's one lesson. Again, it's not the perfect lesson. It's not the only lesson. It's just one lesson that I happened to teach, I think, 2 weeks ago. My lessons are shorter now than they were when we were in person. I'm trying to hit 1 or 2 skills in each lesson, no more, because more than that I find is cognitive overload for students. And again, that connects to my belief that learning should be equitable, that I have to make sure I'm moving at the right pace to challenge students appropriately and make sure that all students can rise to the occasion and can master these skills. So this is representative of how I'm approaching teaching right now in this unique context. And it highlights some of my big beliefs about teaching, which I'll just show you again here. So I believe that when we teach in this way, we treat our students as individuals, we learn who they are, and ultimately we create space for them to be the heroes of their own stories. We create space where learning feels empowering to them, where learning feels like it matters, and where they feel like they can achieve. But teachers don't do our work in isolation. So I want to talk really briefly about what the culture of a school has to be like in order to make this kind of teaching possible. There are 3 things that I think have to be true in schools to make this teaching possible. The first is teacher autonomy. Teachers have to have the autonomy to make decisions about curriculum and classroom culture based on what we know about our students and our expertise. I chose the book that we're reading because of what I know about my students, because of the questions that they've asked me over the years, and because of my expertise in knowing those learning standards and knowing that that book can help me hit those learning standards. When teachers are forced to teach in a certain way, when every decision about our curriculum is made for us, I believe that that disempowers us as experts. Teachers have to have autonomy to make decisions. Teachers have to be supported in reflecting on what we're doing so that we can make the best decisions possible. So I have a coach who helps me, who looks at my lessons with me, who asks me questions, who says, okay, you're reading this book. How do you know the students are learning? All of that is true. All of that is good. We need to have that support and that accountability. But we need to be respected as people who can make smart decisions about curriculum. We have to have autonomy. That's number 1. Number 2, the adults in a school have to collaborate regularly and honestly with one another. I like to call this radical vulnerability, and it's radical because often in education, we have a mindset that we have to be perfect, that we have to have it all figured out, or else we're not good at our job. And so we hide all of the ways that we still have so much to learn. We shy away from talking about our mistakes and our missteps. We close our classroom doors to one another. But when we allow ourselves to become vulnerable and to shift that culture among educators, we can learn and grow so much. So in our schools, educators have to have time to collaborate with one another, to share the problems that we're having, to brainstorm solutions together, and to work together to get better. So that's 2. Finally, our schools have to be dedicated to equity. When we do this work, we have to think about all of our learners, and we have to think about really intentionally, what do we need to do to make sure that all of our learners can access this material? When we do this work, when we decide that we want to actually do something different for the students who walk into our classrooms, students like Chris, my student from so long ago, we have to ask ourselves some really tough questions. If we want to get to equity, we have to ask ourselves, who are our school systems set up for? And how does that impact our students' journeys? So we need to commit to learning about culturally responsive teaching and then make real pedagogical shifts to ensure that what we're doing works best for our students. One example of that here in America, we have to think about how does white supremacist culture undergird our school and our classroom policies, and what can we do to change those policies? This is big work. It's work that goes beyond just our classroom. And I'm talking to you today, again, not because I have that all figured out. I don't. I still have far to go to become a truly culturally responsive educator within my school, within the system as a whole. But as I've said a couple of times today, to be an educator is to constantly learn and grow right alongside our students. And so here's the thing that we all know, but we need to be reminded of again and again as teachers. When we teach, when we devote our days to working with students, that work is magical and world-changing and high stakes. But we have to remind ourselves, we don't have to be perfect in this work. We don't have to get everything right the first time or all the time. We just have to be brave enough to try, to reflect on whether we're seeing our students as heroes, on whether we're doing everything we can to ensure that their journeys are transformative. Because that's what we all want for our own students. So my daughter is 6 now, my own child, but back when she was 2 or 3, we read this book together about a cat named Splat. And the gist of the book is that Splat the cat is nervous and doesn't want to go to school. But his mom forces him to go, and when he gets there, his teacher is this wonderful, warm, giant cat teacher. And the first lesson she teaches all the little cat students is this: cats are amazing. That's the lesson. A bunch of other things happen in the book, but I don't remember them because as a mom and as a teacher, that scene stood out. That was such an important lesson for the students to hear from their teachers. You are amazing. It was more important than grades. It was more important than content. It was more important than behavior. You are amazing. So on that note, think back to my student, Chris. I want you to think right now of your students, but especially your Chris's. You know, the students like my student who are carrying some kind of weight into school. And maybe it's manifesting as defiance or disrespect or disinterest. Think about that weight. What are those students carrying with them every day? Let's not fall into the trap of thinking that our kids, our Chris's, and everyone else are all tragedy. Let's think about the strengths that these children are bringing into school with them as well. What makes these kids amazing? What assets do they bring into our schools? So here's the question. How are you going to challenge yourself to see and recognize your Chris's unique amazingness? How are you going to help your Chris's feel like heroes? And finally, who are your allies in that work? Because this work is too hard, it's too real, it's too important to go at it alone. If we're alone on the road, it's too easy to turn back. So who's going to hold you accountable? Who's going to remind you why it's worth doing? As you continue through your journey as an educator, I hope you can keep some of these questions in mind. The work that we do with our kids is critical to building a world that is more just. I want to say that again because it's such an important part of what I believe about our work. The work that we do with our kids is critical to building a world that is more just. So I know you didn't decide to be a teacher because you thought it would be easy. I know that the work sometimes feels too big and too heavy to hold. But I want to let you know that I appreciate you because you are holding it, and I'm holding it with you. So I want to end by reminding you that you, too, are amazing. The work that you do with young people matters. The work that you do is absolutely essential. So thank you for making the decision to be an educator. And I hope that something I said today helps you in your journey.
질문. 미국의 올해의 교사상 선정 절차를 보고 까다롭기는 하지만 상의 권위에 맞게 심사하고 수상한다고 느꼈습니다. 이에 반해 우리나라는 심사 과정도 크게 까다롭지 않고 상의 권위도 미국에 비해 떨어진다고 생각합니다. 올해의 교사상을 미국에서는 백악관에서 수상하는 것에 반해 우리는 그만큼의 권위를 인정해주지 않는 것 같아 아쉽습니다. 미국 내에서 교사상을 받은 교사들에 대한 사회적 인식이 어떤지, 교사로서 자긍심을 갖기에 충분한지 궁금합니다. 교사상이 아니더라도 교사로서의 삶에 확신을 가질 수 있는 외적인 보상이 있다면 어떤 것일까요?
So, this is a great question. I think that the perception of Teachers of the Year is one of respect, but I think that that respect and celebration doesn't always translate necessarily into professional respect in terms of our expertise. So I think that other teachers see teachers who have received this kind of award with respect. I think that, on a fundamental level, it's a respected award and a respected title. But for a lot of teachers, what we're really looking for is for that respect to translate into us being seen as experts when policymakers, for example, are making decisions about education. And what we sometimes find is that policymakers or the heads of education systems might be really willing to celebrate us and to congratulate us, but not necessarily to bring us in as experts and have us help with decision making. And I think that that's true of teachers in the US as a whole. We aren't often seen by people who have the authority to make broad decisions in education as the kind of experts who could help inform those decisions. So that's one part. The next part is the award enough for us to be proud of ourselves as teachers? I think that really varies, but I think probably, as well as it's probably similar in our two countries that teachers who want to be great are always trying to get better. We always see room for improvement in our work, and we always think about the ways in which we have not quite reached all of our goals and our aspirations for ourselves as teachers. So for me, it was a very proud moment to be named Teacher of the Year. It still is something that I'm very proud of, but I also often feel like I still have so much to work on. And I know that just because I was named the Teacher of the Year doesn't mean that I've reached the peak of my career. It doesn't mean that I'm the very best teacher. It doesn't mean that I don't have a lot left to learn. So there's always a balance there between, yes, I feel proud, proud of the recognition and proud of being able to go out and talk to people like I am here, but always feeling like there's so much more to do. And I think sometimes a danger of an award like this is that it can really lead teachers to feeling a lot of imposter syndrome, where we worry that, because we have this title, people are thinking that we're going to be really great, and in fact we're not, and it can lead to us doubting ourselves even more. And then the final part of the question is, what could be external rewards to give you confidence in your life as a teacher? I think that ultimately external rewards are nice, but the thing that gives you confidence as a teacher is seeing results from your students. So when students either show a lot of growth in their academic knowledge and skills, or when students tell you that you've made a difference for them, that you've helped them in some way, that's the thing that I think really gives us a lot of confidence, more so than external rewards.
질문. 강에 감명 깊게 들었습니다. 그런데 조금 엉뚱한 생각이긴 하지만 때로는 조력자가 아니라 악당도 영웅의 성장에 중요한 역할을 한다고 생각합니다. 영웅 이야기를 학생의 성장과 그 성장을 지켜보는 교사의 성장에 대입해 설명해 주셨는데요. 한국의 많은 선생님들이 공감하셨습니다. 그런데 혹시 아이들이 영웅이 되는 과정에서 악당 역할을 할 교사도 필요하지 않을런지요? 늘 학생의 마음을 읽어주는 교사가 되는 게 어렵다고 느끼는 교사들에게 조언을 부탁드립니다.
So there's a lot packed into this question. I would say there is a part of school, there's a part of being a teacher that is necessarily about challenging students, pushing them outside of their comfort zones, and pushing them to do things that they don't think they can do. So if that's what you mean by villain, if by villain you mean someone who places challenges in front of students, then yes, I think that's a part of our job, but I wouldn't characterize that as being a villain. To me, a villain is someone who makes your life more difficult for no good reason at all. Haven't really thought about this, but for me, a villain would be someone who doesn't try to understand students, who doesn't have students' best interest in mind, who doesn't put students at the center of their decision making. Whereas a teacher who is helping a student become a hero is a teacher who is helping them to face and overcome challenges, but is also placing some of those challenges in front of them, because that's how students learn. We learn when we face something that's difficult, that's outside of our comfort zone, that's unknown. And that is part of our job. Part of our job is to create academic problems for students, and to then support them through solving those problems. So that would be my answer to the villain piece. In terms of the piece about being able to read students' minds, we don't have to read students' minds. What we have to be able to do is develop a relationship with them where they'll tell us what's on their mind. So there are lots of ways to go about that, but developing routines in the classroom around things like giving students time to journal or reflect or write or talk about how they're feeling about the work, but also just about their life and what's happening. We can create space in class to do things like that, to then form relationships with students. When something is going on with a student and we can't figure out what it is, we can be the kinds of teachers who ask them. And the students might not answer. We might say, I'm concerned about you. What's happening? And they might say, oh, nothing. Everything's fine. But the fact that we've asked them, that we've tried to reach out to them, that will stick, and they'll remember that. I had a student once a few years ago who I asked her weekly, how are you? You seem upset. You seem sad. What's going on? Can we talk? How can I help? And she would never give me anything in response. She would say, nothing's wrong, everything's fine. And then after 3 years of this, 3 years of me offering to check in, asking if she was okay, finally one day she came to me and she asked if I could talk. And she ended up talking to me for an hour that day and telling me everything that was going on. And I don't think she would have done that if I hadn't extended that offer, and if I hadn't made it clear to her that I was someone she could come to if she wanted to. I didn't force the issue. I didn't try to force her to tell me what was going on. I didn't try to read her mind. I just said to her, are you okay? How can I help? Would you like to talk? I did that enough times, and then she did. So I don't think that great teachers read students' minds. And I think if we think that we're reading students' minds, we're probably not actually listening as much to them as we should be, because we're assuming that we know what they're thinking. So it's just about how can you create an environment where students feel welcome and open to share with you if they need to, and where you can create some routines in your class to hear from students, whether that be through journaling or check-ins in class where you say things like, okay, we just went over that problem together. Let's give me on a scale of 1 to 5. 1, you didn't understand that at all. 5, you completely understood that and it was really helpful. Where are you? And just sort of that little check-in with students can give us a sense of how they're doing. But if we don't take the time to ask those questions, we may never know. So yeah, I hope that answers that question about the villain and reading students' minds. And thank you so much for submitting that question.